I would like to come back to an earlier point, if I may, too, and that is the notion that atheists are somehow the intelligentsia among us and so forth. I think this is just completely false. The spate of new books published by the new atheists like Harris and Hitchens and Dawkins and so forth are not sophisticated books intellectually. These are, for the most part, angry, bitter diatribes against religion. And while someone like Dawkins may be a good scientist in his field, when he begins to talk about philosophy and theology, he is merely a layman. And The God Delusion is a very unsophisticated book intellectually. As a philosopher, I was just appalled at the arguments he gives in that book. It is an embarrassment, really, I think.
Well, I can agree, and I suspect Michael may as well. That
I think he would, too.
If you look at the reviews, this man is respected in his field.
Yes.
But this book, if you look at the reviews, they're quite damning. I used to work with Chris Hitchens. He's a bright guy. He's a fun guy. This is not a profound book. It's a fun book in many ways. So I think most people would agree that the three you mentioned in particular, Dawkins, Harris, and Hitchens, what they've written is not first-class scholarship. However, there are first-class scholars and genuine intellectuals who do not believe at all in God.
Certainly there are, Michael, but there has also been, especially over the last 50 years, since the late 1960s, a literal revolution in my discipline, philosophy, in the Anglo-American world, which has brought about a renaissance of Christian philosophy, such that some of our finest philosophers at our most prestigious universities are now outspoken Bible-believing Christians.
Sir?
I'm sorry, where is this philosophical revolution taking place?
In the Anglo-American realm.
The ones dominated by assumed atheists, like people like Ayer, people like Bertrand Russell, who really dominated. Like, well, I'm sorry, I just never have heard
What was the first
this.
thing you said?
I think you meant Ayer.
Oh,
A.J. Ayer.
But
that's a bygone generation, Michael. I'm talking about today.
Okay, let's talk about people from today, like Quine, right?
He's dead too.
Well, he died only a couple of years, like
so did Freddie Ayer, but I mean...
let's talk about, let's name names, people like Richard Swinburne at Oxford University, Robert and Marilyn Adams at Oxford, Brian Leftow at Oxford, people like Alvin Planning at University of Notre Dame, Peter Van Inwagen, Dallas Willard, Eleanor Stump. I mean, I could go on and on naming names at top universities in America and England who are outspoken Christians, such that the face of my discipline, compared to the 1930s and 40s, when Russell and Ayer were dominant, has been utterly transformed.
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Yes, indeed.
The question I've got is, what would that extraordinary evidence be in the first century? You didn't have video cameras, you didn't have scientific tests, so what would that look like?
If there had been a video camera there at the door of the tomb, you know, and we could see the angel coming down, rolling aside the big stone, that sort of thing, well, I would say probably, first of all, it was made in the Walt Disney studio. That would be my first hypothesis. You know, that Steven Spielberg had something to do with it, you know.
This watchword, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, is really just an excuse for an a priori rejection of the miraculous, because you weren't, or you didn't give any sort of evidence that would satisfy you with respect to one of these extraordinary claims. It made it sound like, to me, you were saying that nothing would convince you, no matter what.
No, all sorts of things would convince me.
Well, with respect to the resurrection, though, I mean, you even said if there was a video camera, you'd say it was a fake stone that was rolled away. You know, I mean, what sort of...
That would be the more reasonable hypothesis under the circumstances.
Well, but see, that's what I fear. It is. It's just an a priori rejection of the miraculous here. You're not. There isn't any kind of literary testimony, historical testimony that could convince you. But you're saying that when you say extraordinary, really what you're saying is no amount of evidence would convince me of these extraordinary claims.
Sure, it would. If tomorrow morning, immediately after breakfast, suddenly there was an earthquake, you know, and a silvery light shone in the sky, and the leaves dropped from the trees. And I dashed outside, and there, towering over us like 100 Everests, was this giant figure with lightning playing around his Michelangeloid face. And he pointed down and saying, "Be assured, Keith M. Parsons, that I do in fact exist, and I'm sick of your logic chopping." Dr. Craig, I would join you in the pew of the church, in the front pew of the church the next Sunday. You know.
Be going to the question and answer period. We're going to go to the question and answer period, so be going to the microphone as we wind this down.
You don't think that you would have said, boy, I was having a hallucination. I was simply saying that this is not a mere matter of speculation, that there's more than a tiny bit of evidence on the table.
But is he saying
evidence for what?
Evidence for a beginning of the universe.
Yes. Well, we know that. Nobody disputes
all right, well, that's what I'm offering in this first argument, is the evidence.
But because there's a beginning doesn't imply a God.
It does if the first premise is true, that whatever begins to exist has a cause. It logically follows that
but the cause hasn't got to be God.
Well, remember I gave an argument for thinking that this cause is timeless, spaceless, immaterial, enormously powerful, and personal.
I think it's a computer.
Well, that wouldn't... computers are designed by people.
No, this is a self-designing computer.
Timeless.
Timeless.
Well, that's a contradiction in terms.
Why is it timeless? What's contradictory about it?
A computer has to function. It takes time.
No, this is a special computer.
Yeah, but it has to be logically coherent.
Oh, it's logically coherent?
Yes, you have to be logically coherent.
Oh, no, this computer is amazing.
No, besides, it would have to be, as I said, a personal being.
No.
A computer is a physical
Not this computer.
Object.
Oh,
well, then,
no.
Okay, see, what you're doing is what you're calling a computer is really God. A non-physical, It's just another word if you rob it of all the attributes that make it a computer.
There's a lot of talk about the burden of proof, and I just wanted to point out firstly that you cannot prove the non-existence of a thing, and naturalists accept this. But the problem is when you invoke God as an explanation for that, what you're doing is you're invoking something that is inherently inexplicable. Thereby, you're not solving the problem, you're not explaining anything, you're confounding the problem. You have more to explain, and I just want to ask you, do you think that invoking God as a hypothesis about natural things or the origin of life or the origin of the universe, I think that's an advancement to knowledge?
Now, repeat the first part of the question again, because I disagreed with what you said there.
It is impossible to prove the
impossible to prove something does not exist. That's silly. Of course you can prove something does not exist. We can prove, for example, that there are no living Tyrannosaurus rex on the face of the earth. We can prove that there are no Muslims of the United States Senate. Or, as Dr. Shook says, if you can show that something is a self-contradiction, he's in the House. Yeah. You can show that something is self-contradictory. So there are no married bachelors. So this is an atheist line that you hear on a popular level all the time, but that sophisticated atheists don't take, because it is easy to prove that things don't exist. Now the question is, if it is the case that you can't prove that God does not exist, then you shouldn't be a naturalist. You should be some sort of agnostic or something, but you shouldn't go around saying things like, nature is all there is. There is nothing beyond matter and energy. There is no supernatural reality, because those claims exceed what you yourself say you can prove. So you need to make more modest claims about your position that are more simply agnostic or something, and find a new name rather than naturalism, because that isn't something that you can sustain the burden of proof for. Now, the last part of your question assumed that I was presenting God as some sort of an explanatory hypothesis. And if you look at my arguments, they're not like that. These are deductive arguments. Now, what that means is that if the premises are true, that the conclusion follows logically and necessarily. Whether you like it or not, whether you think it's explanatory or not, it doesn't matter. All that matters is, are the premises more plausibly true than not? Because if they are, then the conclusion is logically unavoidable. And so, yes, I think they definitely represent an increase in knowledge. This is an example of deductive logical reasoning. And it can't be impugned by saying that it's not some sort of explanatory inference to the best explanation or something of that sort.
Think about Epicurus' argument that if God is omnibenevolent, omniscient, and omnipotent, if he knows about kids in Africa and that are born with AIDS, what do you think about him suggesting, like him not intervening and him not changing that fact? Like, that's a question that I've always struggled with, so I'm just wondering, like, could you expand on that, and I'd also like your input on it?
The problem of evil and suffering has been greatly discussed by philosophers, and I think there's been genuine progress made in this century on this problem. I think it's important to distinguish between the intellectual problem of suffering and the emotional problem of suffering, because these are quite different from each other. In terms of the intellectual problem of suffering, I think that there you need to ask yourself, is the atheist claiming, as Epicurus did, that the existence of God is logically incompatible with the evil and suffering in the world? If that's what the atheist is claiming, then he's got to be presupposing some kind of hidden assumptions that would bring out that contradiction and make it explicit, because these statements are not explicitly contradictory. The problem is no philosopher in the history of the world has ever been able to identify what those hidden assumptions would be that would bring out the contradiction and make it explicit. On the contrary, you can actually prove that these are logically compatible with each other by adding a third proposition, namely that God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil in the world. As long as that statement is even possibly true, it proves that there's no logical incompatibility between God and the suffering in the world. So the atheist would have to show that it is logically impossible for God to have morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil and suffering in the world, and no atheist has ever been able to do that. So the logical version of this problem, I think, is widely recognized to have failed. Those atheists who still press the problem, therefore press it as a probabilistic argument. They try to say that given the evil in the world, it's improbable that God exists. Not impossible, but improbable. Well, again, the difficulty there is that the atheist has to claim that if God did exist, then it is improbable that he would permit the evil and suffering in the world. And how could the atheist possibly know that? How could the atheist know that God would not, if he existed, permit the evil and suffering in the world? Maybe he's got good reasons for it. Maybe, like in Christian theism, God's purpose for human history is to bring the maximum number of people freely into his kingdom to find salvation and eternal life. And how do we know that that wouldn't require a world that is simply suffused with natural and moral suffering? It might be that only in a world like that the maximal number of people would freely come to know God and find salvation. So the atheist would have to show that there is a possible world that's feasible for God, which God could have created, that would have just as much salvation and eternal life and knowledge of God as the actual world, but with less suffering. And how could the atheist prove such a thing? It's sheer speculation. So the problem is that as an argument, the problem of evil makes probability judgments which are very, very ambitious and which we are simply not in a position to make with any kind of confidence. Now, I recognize that that philosophical response to the question doesn't deal with the emotional problem of evil. And I think for most people, this isn't really a philosophical problem. It's an emotional problem. They just don't like a God who would permit suffering and pain in the world. And so they turn their backs on him. What does Christianity have to say to this problem? Well, I think it has a lot to say. It tells us that God is not some sort of an impersonal ground of being or an indifferent tyrant who folds his arms and watches the world suffer. Rather, he is a God who enters into human history in the person of Jesus Christ. And what does he do? He suffers. On the cross, Christ bore a suffering of which we can form no conception. Even though he was innocent, he bore the penalty of the sins of the whole world. None of us can comprehend what he suffered. And I think when we contemplate the cross of Christ and his love for us and what he was willing to undergo for us, it puts the problem of suffering in an entirely different perspective. It means, I think, that we can bear the suffering that God calls upon us to endure in this life with courage and with optimism for an eternal life of unending joy beyond the grave because of what Christ has done for us. And he will give us, I think, the courage and the strength to get through the suffering that God calls upon us to bear in this life. So whether it's an emotional issue or an intellectual issue, I think ultimately Christian theism can make sense out of the suffering and evil in the world. All right, how are we to understand this passage where Thomas refuses to believe, so Jesus appears to Thomas and says, don't be doubting, put forth your finger and feel my wounds, put forth your hand and feel my side. And Thomas doesn't do it then. He just falls on the floor and says, my Lord and my God. And Jesus then says, do you believe because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. Is this somehow depreciating the value of evidence and saying that it's better to believe by blind faith without evidence? I don't think that that's a proper understanding of the passage. What Thomas refused to do was to believe the apostolic testimony to the resurrection of Jesus. The other apostles had said to him, we have seen the Lord. And Thomas refused to believe the apostolic witness to Jesus, but demanded that he himself be able to see the risen Lord. And I think what Jesus is saying, blessed are those who do believe the apostolic witness, but aren't demanding that I appear to them at every generation in history, to every individual who's ever born, but rather they believe on the basis of the eyewitness testimony that the apostles gave. And so that's why after that blessing on Thomas, it goes on to say, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. So John is emphasizing the sufficiency of the apostolic testimony that he delivers to the resurrection of Jesus, which Thomas doubted wrongfully. And we shouldn't be like Thomas. We should not demand that Jesus appear to me in my bedroom, but that we should believe the apostolic eyewitness testimony to this event.